April 3, 1865, the road west of Petersburg, Virginia. The air tastes of sulfur and something older. Wet Virginia clay, horse sweat, the particular rot of 10 months of siege. Ulysses S. Grant is not sitting in a command tent surrounded by maps. He is riding, hard. His uniform is mud-caked from boot to shoulder, the brass buttons of a lieutenant general's coat barely visible beneath the road dust of 1,000 soldiers pressing westward through the breaking Confederate dark. His head is splitting, a migraine that has followed him for 3 days like an unwanted courier. But he does not slow his horse. He cannot slow, because somewhere to the west, moving through that same darkness, through the same Virginia mud that swallows boots whole, Robert E. Lee is running, and Ulysses Grant has given the order of his life. Do not let him escape. 3 words that contain a war, 5 syllables that could end 4 years of fire. The Virginia night is cold and absolute, broken only by the distant orange glow behind them. Richmond burning, the Confederate capital put to the torch by the men who had defended it. Denial as final, desperate strategy. Grant watches the glow without sentiment. He does not feel triumph. He feels time. Every minute Lee is moving. Every mile west that army travels is another mile toward Joseph Johnston in North Carolina. Another mile toward the one thing that could make this war go on forever. Grant presses forward. The cavalry is already ahead of him, Sheridan's horsemen crashing through the darkness like a hammer looking for an anvil. Somewhere in this broken geography of Virginia pine and red clay, the Confederacy is dying. Grant intends to be there when it does. To understand the brutal mathematics of this chase, you have to understand what April 2nd meant. Not in the abstract, not as a date on a calendar, but as the moment a 10-month siege finally cracked like a bone under pressure. Grant had 125,000 men. Lee had perhaps 60,000, and that number was a charitable estimate. Confederate soldiers had been walking away from the Petersburg lines for weeks, not deserting in the heroic literary sense, but simply leaving, vanishing in the night, walking home through pine barrens and tobacco fields, because a man can only be hungry so long before his feet make the decision his loyalty could not. Lee knew his army was dissolving. He knew it the way a general knows when he stops counting strengths and starts counting absences. The fortifications at Petersburg were extraordinary works of military engineering. Miles of earthworks, abattis, sharpened stakes, rifle pits, bomb-proofs, all of it constructed by 60,000 exhausted men over 10 months of grinding siege. The soldiers who built those works had earned the right to be proud of them, but earthworks cannot fight without men behind them, and the men were leaving. What terrified Abraham Lincoln, who had carried this war across 4 years of catastrophic generalship, through McClellan's paralysis, through Burnside's slaughter at Fredericksburg, through Hooker's collapse at Chancellorsville, was not that Lee might win a battle. Those days were gone. The Confederacy no longer had the strength for decisive offensive action. What terrified Lincoln was escape. A wounded animal is the most dangerous animal. A Lee who reached North Carolina with even 30,000 men, who linked up with Johnston's army and vanished into the pine forests and mountain hollows of the Deep South, would not be a defeated general. He would be the beginning of a 30-year insurgency. He would be a ghost war that would haunt the Republic for generations. Lincoln had looked at Grant across a steamboat cabin in March and said it directly: finish it. Do not let it become something that goes on and on. Grant had understood. He had always understood. The lost cause mythology, that perfumed lie that Confederate apologists spent 50 years constructing in bronze and marble, wants you to believe that Lee was invincible, that if the gods had been kinder, if Longstreet had moved faster at Gettysburg, if Jackson had not been accidentally shot by his own men in the dark at Chancellorsville, the South would have won. That is the lie. The truth is more merciless and more honest. By April 1865, Lee was not commanding from genius. He was commanding from habit. The same brilliant tactical mind that had destroyed Pope at Second Bull Run, that had humiliated Burnside at Fredericksburg, that had somehow split his army in the face of a superior enemy at Chancellorsville and won. That mind was still there, still firing, still producing maneuvers of desperate ingenuity. But minds cannot eat. Armies eat. And Lee's army had not eaten properly since winter. Go back 3 weeks to understand how complete the unraveling was. March 25th, 1865. Lee, watching his lines stretch thinner and thinner as Grant pressed westward, made a gamble. He attacked. Fort Stedman, a Union position on the eastern face of the Petersburg perimeter, became the target. Confederate soldiers under General John B. Gordon broke through the outer works at 4 in the morning. For 2 hours, it looked like a miracle was possible. Confederate troops poured through the breach, capturing Union artillery, pushing deep into the defensive lines. Men who had been starving for months moved with the particular fury of men who have nothing left to lose, their butternut gray uniforms in tatters, their feet wrapped in strips of blanket where boots had worn through. For those 2 hours, the men around Grant held their breath. Then Grant acted. He had positioned reserves. He had anticipated that a desperate Lee might try something bold, something irrational, and he had prepared for it. Union counterattacks hit the Confederate breakthrough from 3 directions simultaneously. The assault collapsed. By noon, Gordon's men were back behind their own lines, and Lee had lost approximately 4,000 men he could not replace. The last Confederate offensive was finished before the Virginia sun reached midday. Grant looked at the smashed remnants of the Fort Stedman attack and saw what it really meant. It meant Lee had no margin left. It meant the Army of Northern Virginia was out of options except one: stay and be destroyed, or run and hope. And Grant had already decided what to do about hope. On April 1st, he sent Sheridan, Philip Henry. Sheridan was everything McClellan was not. Where McClellan had seen reasons to pause, Sheridan saw reasons to accelerate. Where Burnside had found obstacles, Sheridan found solutions. He was 5 feet 5 inches of aggressive, competitive, profane energy, a man who understood cavalry the way a musician understands rhythm, not as theory, but as sensation. Grant loved him for it. The assignment was the South Side Railroad and the White Oak Road position, Lee's last credible Western supply line. If it fell, the Petersburg perimeter would become a coffin. Sheridan hit 5 Forks on April 1st with cavalry and Warren's 5th Corps, a hammer and anvil operation that swept around the Confederate right flank with the speed of men who knew what was at stake. The Confederate forces under George Pickett, the same Pickett whose name had become synonymous with the Great Charge at Gettysburg, were shattered. Pickett himself was apparently at a shad bake when the attack began, a detail so surreal it belongs in fiction, but belongs instead in history. By evening, 5 Forks was Union ground, the railroad was cut, and Lee's western wall had crumbled. That night, April 1st into April 2nd, Grant ordered a general assault along the entire Petersburg line. Artillery opened at dawn, 137 guns firing simultaneously, the sound rolling across Virginia like sustained thunder. Union infantry went forward in the gray morning light, blue columns pressing against the Confederate earthworks, and the lines broke, not collapsed, broke. There is a difference. A collapse is total. A break has survivors, has fragments that can retreat, has a general who can still think. Lee's lines broke. He had survivors, he had fragments, and he could still think. He ordered evacuation immediately, understanding that to stay was to be surrounded and captured. By nightfall on April 2nd, Confederate forces were pulling out of the fortifications they had held for 10 months, moving west through the darkness, leaving fires burning in their camps to buy a few hours of confusion. Richmond, the capital of the Confederate States of America, was abandoned. When Union troops entered the next morning, they found it in flames, the Confederates having set fire to the bridges, the warehouses, the tobacco stores, anything that might be useful to the enemy. The greatest city of the South burned itself down rather than surrender intact, and Robert E. Lee was already gone, moving west, moving toward the one word that still meant something to him. Not victory, not honor, supply. At Amelia Courthouse, he had been told, 4 supply trains waited, rations, ammunition, the materials that might allow him to keep moving, to reach North Carolina, to join Johnston, to continue the war for another season. Grant understood this calculation perfectly. He had been inside Lee's strategic thinking for nearly a year, ever since they first met in the blood and smoke of the wilderness in May 1864. Every other Union general who had faced Lee had eventually retreated. Grant had not retreated. After the Wilderness, where Confederate fire had set the underbrush alight and men had burned to death between the lines, Grant had moved sideways, always south, always pressing, never giving Lee the chance to choose ground, never giving him the initiative. Lee had beaten him tactically at every major engagement of the Overland Campaign. At the Wilderness, Confederate infantry had fought Union forces to a brutal standstill. At Spotsylvania, Lee had constructed the Mule Shoe Salient and held it against some of the most ferocious fighting of the war. Hand-to-hand combat at the Bloody Angle, where men fought for 18 hours in driving rain, fighting across earthworks with rifle butts and bayonets, the oak trees literally cut down by musket fire. At Cold Harbor, Grant had made his worst mistake, ordering a frontal assault on prepared Confederate positions that cost 7,000 men in under an hour. An attack so horrifying that Union soldiers pinned their names to their uniforms before going forward so their bodies could be identified. Grant had not been invincible, but he had been relentless. He had kept moving south. He had written home, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." It had taken longer than a summer. It had taken 10 months of siege. And now Lee was running, and Grant was riding west, and the order was simple: do not let him escape. Sheridan received the directive and understood it in the way that only a cavalry commander can, with his body as much as his mind. Cavalry exists for exactly this purpose: to move faster than infantry, to cover ground that foot soldiers cannot, to get ahead of a retreating army and force it to stop or fight at a disadvantage. Sheridan had 13,000 horsemen, organized into 3 divisions: hard-bitten veterans of the Shenandoah Valley Campaign, where Sheridan had spent the autumn of 1864 systematically destroying Confederate logistics, burning barns, driving off livestock, turning the breadbasket of the Confederacy into a charred corridor. These were not parade ground cavalry. These were men who understood pursuit. They moved west with the particular urgency of soldiers who know they are close to something final. April 4th. Lee arrived at Amelia Courthouse and found nothing. The supply trains were not there. They had been rerouted, misdelivered, lost in the chaos of a crumbling Confederate logistics system that had been dying by degrees for 2 years. This was not a minor setback. This was catastrophe. An army that hasn't eaten properly in weeks, now given one more day of hunger while it forages the surrounding farms for parched corn and raw grain that will give men cramps without giving them strength. One day, 24 hours of delay. It does not sound like much. In the mathematics of pursuit, it was everything. That single lost day allowed Sheridan's cavalry to close the distance. Every hour Lee waited at Amelia Courthouse eating hardtack that wasn't there. Sheridan's horses covered miles. By April 5th, Confederate stragglers began to see Union cavalry through the tree lines, not pursuing from the rear, but riding parallel, pushing to get ahead, like a wolf pack angling to cut off the deer. Lee's men knew what that meant. They could feel the trap forming around them the way a man in water feels the cold. On April 6th, at a place called Sailor's Creek, the trap closed on part of the Confederate column. Sheridan's cavalry, fighting partly mounted and partly on foot as dismounted infantry, hit the rear of Lee's army with the full weight of pursuit turned into attack. The fighting was desperate. Confederate soldiers fighting with the fury of men who know they are beaten but cannot accept it. Union soldiers fighting with the efficiency of men who know they are winning and want it done. When Union infantry arrived to reinforce Sheridan's horsemen, the Confederate position collapsed. Approximately 7,700 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms at Sailor's Creek. Confederate General Richard Ewell was captured. 6 Confederate generals surrendered. 1/4 of Lee's remaining army was gone in an afternoon. When Lee heard the numbers, when the reports came back to him through aides who could barely bring themselves to speak the figures, he looked back at the column of smoke rising from Sailor's Creek and said something to no one in particular, something that revealed the full depth of what was happening. "My God," he said, "has the army dissolved?" It had not dissolved. Not yet, but it was dissolving. Lee ordered another night march. They would move by dark, move faster, move without stopping. 30 miles through the Virginia night, through rain and mud, crossing the Appomattox River at High Bridge, the Confederate rear guard trying to burn the bridge behind them to slow pursuit. Union General Edward Wright got there in time. The bridge was damaged but not destroyed. Grant's men crossed. The pursuit did not stop. It could not stop. On April 7th, as Lee's army staggered westward, barefoot soldiers leaving blood in the mud, men falling out of column to sit against trees and simply be done, officers shouting themselves hoarse, trying to keep the column moving, Grant did something remarkable. He stopped riding long enough to write a letter. He was somewhere on the Virginia roads, surrounded by the noise of 100,000 men in motion, and he sat down and wrote to Robert E. Lee with a clarity that no amount of gunfire had ever produced in him. The result of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Confederate States Army, he wrote. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. No threats, no gloating. Facts stated plainly, by a man whose mud-spattered uniform bore no insignia that distinguished him from his own privates. Grant chewed his unlit cigar and handed the letter to a courier and went back to riding west. Lee received the letter somewhere on the march and replied that he did not believe the situation required surrender, but he asked what terms Grant would offer. It was the first flicker of something beyond defiance. Not surrender, not yet, but the beginning of a man preparing himself for a conclusion he can see coming. Grant replied that he had one condition: peace, the restoration of the Union. He would discuss details. Lee read the reply on horseback while his army shuffled past him, the men too tired to wonder what their general was reading, too hungry to care about anything except whether there was food ahead. There was no food ahead. There were supply trains, 4 of them, loaded with 300,000 rations, waiting at Appomattox Station. Lee knew they were there. His army moved toward them the way a wounded man moves toward water, with everything left in them, the last biological imperative of organisms who need sustenance to survive. April 8th. The Confederate column approached Appomattox Station from the east. They were close. The trains were there. Lee could almost taste the end of the hunger that had been killing his army, one missed meal at a time. George Armstrong Custer arrived first. Custer was 25 years old and reckless in the way that only the young and lucky can be reckless. A cavalry general who had survived so many impossible situations that he had begun to believe in his own invulnerability. He would not be that lucky in 11 years at the Little Bighorn. But on April 8, 1865, at Appomattox Station, Custer rode hard and arrived before Lee. His cavalry hit the supply trains in the late afternoon, tearing into the Confederate supply depot with the enthusiasm of men who understood that destroying these rations meant the end. They burned what they could, captured what they couldn't burn, drove off the trains that hadn't been seized, and then seized the high ground west of Appomattox Courthouse. The ground west of the village, the escape route, the road to Lynchburg, the road to North Carolina, the road that Lee needed to still exist as a fighting force rather than a memory. When Lee heard the news, the supply trains gone, the western road blocked, he gathered his remaining commanders, Gordon, Longstreet, Fitzhugh Lee, the faces of men who had been fighting since 1861, who had seen Antietam and Fredericksburg and Gettysburg and the Wilderness, and 100 smaller engagements that history forgot, but the survivors never did. The tent was lit by a single candle. The faces around that candle were gaunt, the cheekbones pressing against skin drawn tight by months of inadequate rations, the eyes carrying the particular hollowness of men who have spent too long in proximity to death. Lee was 60 years old, and he looked older. His chest had been troubling him since the early days of the siege, a physical manifestation of the cardiac condition that would ultimately kill him 5 years later. He sat at the center of the circle of candlelight and said what had to be said. They would attack at dawn. Gordon's infantry would hit Sheridan's cavalry. If they could break through, the army might still reach Lynchburg. It might still live to fight another day. The attack came at dawn on April 9th, 1865. Gordon's men went forward in the gray light, Confederate infantry moving against Union cavalry in one of the last offensive actions of the Army of Northern Virginia. The cavalry fell back, outnumbered and outpressed by men fighting with the desperation of a cause they could not yet abandon. Sheridan's horsemen gave ground. For a few minutes, in the early morning light of a Sunday in April, it looked like the impossible might happen. The Confederate line pushed forward. The road west seemed to be opening, and then Gordon looked past the retreating cavalry toward the ridge beyond. Blue uniforms, thousands of them. Not cavalry, infantry, regiment after regiment appearing over the ridgeline, their battle flags catching the early light, the distinctive dark blue of the Army of the Potomac settling into line of battle on the high ground. The 5th Corps under Charles Griffin and the 24th Corps under John Gibbon had marched through the night, 30 miles in 21 hours, Gibbon's men arriving at Appomattox Courthouse at 4 in the morning and deploying in the dark, finding their positions by feel and by the orders of officers who had learned to move armies the way surgeons learn to move instruments, quickly and with purpose. They were not there when the attack began. They were there when the attack needed them. Grant had been thinking ahead, as he always had been thinking ahead, the logistical chess player who understood that cavalry wins pursuits but infantry wins battles, and that Sheridan needed infantry behind him when the final moment came. Gordon sent word back to Lee. The message has survived in the historical record with the blunt simplicity that history sometimes produces to describe the collapse of great enterprises. My command has been fought to a frazzle. I cannot long go forward. Lee received the message on horseback. He was wearing his finest uniform, gray wool, gold braid, a jeweled sword at his hip, as if he had dressed knowing that this day would end in ceremony. Perhaps he had. Perhaps the uniform was an act of preparation, a man dressing for the part he had to play. He received Gordon's message and sat very still on his horse traveler, the gray war horse that had carried him through 4 years of impossible country. The men around him said he sat for a long time, long enough that it became uncomfortable, long enough that aides began to wonder whether to speak. Then Robert E. Lee turned to his staff and said the words that ended the Civil War. "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant." The men around him did not speak. Some wept. Lee did not weep. He sat straight in his saddle and looked at the landscape around him. The Virginia spring beginning to happen without caring about the war, the dogwoods somewhere in the tree lines, the red clay roads wet with recent rain, and he understood something that only a man who has truly fought to the end can understand. He had been beaten, not by Grant's numbers, though the numbers had been part of it, not by Sherman's march through the South, though that had strangled Confederate logistics. He had been beaten by a man who had understood something fundamental about this war from the very beginning. You cannot outlast a force that will not let you rest. You cannot outmaneuver a pursuit that always gets ahead of you. You cannot win a race when your opponent controls the railroad junction at the finish line. Lee had been the greatest tactical general of the war, and it had not been enough, because Grant had never offered him the terrain on which tactical genius could operate. Grant had kept him running until there was nowhere left to run. Lee sent his aide, Charles Marshall, to find a suitable location for the meeting. Marshall found Wilmer McLean's house at the edge of Appomattox Courthouse Village. The name McLean carries its own kind of historical poetry. Wilmer McLean had owned a farm near Manassas, Virginia in the summer of 1861, and Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard had briefly used it as his headquarters during the First Battle of Bull Run. A Union artillery shell had landed in McLean's kitchen. He had decided that the war was too close, and he had moved his family south to Appomattox, a small, quiet village in the Virginia Piedmont, as far from the fighting as a man with limited means could reasonably get. The war had followed him like a creditor. It was ending in his parlor. At 1:30 in the afternoon on April 9, 1865, they came to McLean's house from different directions. Lee arrived first, immaculate, the jeweled sword catching the afternoon light, his white hair and full gray beard giving him the appearance of a figure from antiquity, Cincinnatus perhaps, or some Roman general come to the council of the Senate. He sat in the parlor and waited. Grant arrived 20 minutes later, and the contrast was complete. Grant's uniform was dusty from 4 days of hard riding, mud dried in layers on his boots, a private's coat with lieutenant general's shoulder straps as his only concession to rank. He came in, and they shook hands, and there was a moment, witnessed by the dozen officers crowded into McLean's parlor, when the two men simply looked at each other, the culmination of a year's worth of chess moves and counter moves, ambushes and night marches, telegrams and dispatches, blood and mud and February cold, reduced to two men standing in a Virginia farmhouse in the April light. Grant mentioned Mexico, as men of their generation inevitably did. They had both served in the Mexican-American War 20 years earlier, young officers in a distant conflict that now seemed to belong to another civilization entirely. "I have always remembered your appearance," Grant said, "and I think I should have recognized you anywhere." Lee considered this and replied, with what might have been the faintest shadow of something, not quite shame, not quite sadness, that he could not say the same. He could not recall Grant's face. The general who had studied Lee for a year, who had anticipated his every move, who had ridden through Virginia mud for a week precisely to prevent this man from escaping, this man Lee had not remembered. Grant had known exactly who he was fighting. Lee had known who he was fighting in the strategic sense, but not the human sense, not the face, not the man. And somehow, in that small exchange, the entire shape of the war was contained. Grant wrote out the surrender terms himself, seated at a small table while Lee watched. What he wrote was not what the Confederates had feared. Officers and men would be paroled, allowed to go home on their word of honor not to take up arms again. Soldiers would surrender their weapons, but officers could keep their sidearms and their horses. Cavalrymen and artillerymen who owned their own horses could take them home, because spring planting required horses and starving men needed to farm. And Grant understood that a South which could not plant crops would mean more death from a different kind of war. He would provide rations to Lee's starving army, 25,000 of them. He would feed the men he had been chasing for a week. Lee read the terms and something shifted in his face. He had been braced for punishment. He had been prepared for the worst that a victorious nation could deliver. "This will have the very best possible effect upon the men," Lee said quietly. "It will be very gratifying and will do much toward conciliating our people." The Lost Cause mythology wants you to believe that Grant was a butcher, that his victories came purely from numbers, that any general with Union resources would have done what Grant did. That is the second great lie. The truth is this: the Overland Campaign cost Grant 65,000 casualties in 7 weeks. He was called the Butcher by Northern newspapers. Lincoln was pressured to remove him, and Grant refused to retreat. He refused because he understood something no other Union general had been willing to truly accept, that the price of hesitation was paid in years, and the price of years was paid in lives that would never be calculated in any newspaper tally of battle casualties. Every general who had fought Lee cautiously, McClellan sitting at Harrison's Landing after Antietam when he could have broken the Confederacy in half, Hooker retreating across the Rappahannock after Chancellorsville when the Army of Northern Virginia was briefly split, had bought Confederate longevity with Union blood, extended the war one more season, one more year, one more 100,000 dead. Grant's butcher's math was actually mercy: 40,000 dead in the Overland Campaign to end a war. Or 40,000 dead, then another year, then another, then a guerrilla insurgency through the 1870s and beyond. Grant had made the calculus clear-eyed and acted on it. As Lee rose to leave McLean's house and walked onto the porch, a sound arose from the Union troops gathered outside. The beginning of a cheer, the natural eruption of soldiers who had marched across Virginia mud for 7 days toward this moment. Grant heard it. He turned immediately. "The Confederates are now our prisoners," he told his officers, "and we do not want to exult over their downfall." The cheering stopped. Grant had spent a year hunting Lee across Virginia, and when the hunt was over, his first instinct was to protect the hunted man's dignity. There is a kind of greatness in that, not the greatness of statues and commemorations, but the harder kind. The greatness of a man who does what must be done and then refuses to perform it. 3 days later, on April 12th, Lee's men came forward to stack their arms. They marched through Appomattox courthouse in the morning, carrying battle flags that had been with them since the beginning. Tattered by grapeshot and weather, some so destroyed that only the staff remained, the fabric long since shot away. General Joshua Chamberlain, the Maine professor turned general, who had held Little Round Top at Gettysburg with a bayonet charge when his ammunition ran out, was given command of the Union force receiving the surrender. He ordered his men to attention as the Confederates marched past, the military salute given to an enemy beaten fair and earned. Confederate General John B. Gordon, riding at the head of his men, caught the movement, understood it, and returned the salute. The rifles were stacked. The battle flags were laid down. Men who had not wept in 4 years of war wept over flags, both sides. The thing was over. It was not quite over. Johnston surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina on April 18th. Edmund Kirby Smith surrendered the last Confederate force in the Trans-Mississippi in June. The final shot of the Civil War was arguably fired in June 1865 at the Battle of Palmetto Ranch in Texas, 2 months after Appomattox, a final Confederate tactical victory in a war that had already ended, a battle as melancholy as a flame burning after the candle has been snuffed. But Lee's surrender at Appomattox was the end of the thing in the way that mattered, the end of the cause's credibility, the end of the Army of Northern Virginia's capacity to give the Confederacy a reason to keep fighting. Then, on April 14th, 5 days after the surrender, a 26-year-old actor named John Wilkes Booth walked into Ford's Theater in Washington with a single-shot .44 caliber Derringer and shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning, never knowing whether the mercy he and Grant had tried to build into Appomattox would hold, never seeing whether Reconstruction would become reconciliation or retribution. It became retribution eventually, and then it became something worse. The lost cause, the mythology that transformed Confederate defeat into noble sacrifice, that erected statues of Lee and Jackson in courthouse squares across the South, that rewrote slavery out of the Confederate cause and replaced it with states' rights and Southern honor, a lie so comprehensive that it shaped American memory for a century. Grant, who outlived Lincoln by 20 years, spent the rest of his life arguing against it, arguing that the Confederate cause had been wrong, that slavery had been the war's cause, that Lee's men had fought bravely for a terrible thing. He wrote it in his memoirs, dictated while dying of throat cancer, finishing the manuscript 4 days before he died. The cause of the Confederacy, Grant wrote, was one of the worst for which a people ever fought. Simple, direct, true. What Grant told Sheridan before the final hunt, do not let him escape, get ahead of him, cut off his retreat, keep pressing, was not just military instruction. It was the distillation of a theory of war that Grant had developed through 4 years of hard education, the theory that the object of a war is not to win battles, but to destroy the enemy's capacity and will to continue fighting, and that the fastest path to that destruction runs through relentless, merciless pursuit rather than cautious maneuver. Every day Lee was allowed to rest was a day he could reorganize, resupply, choose new ground. Every hour Sheridan spent behind Lee was an hour Lee spent moving. The order to get ahead, to cut off, to surround, to make escape impossible, was the order that transformed a siege into an ending. It was the order that compressed a war that had stretched 1,000 miles in every direction into a 100-mile chase across Virginia. 7 days, April 3rd to April 9th. The entire remaining military capacity of the Confederate States of America reduced to a column of starving men marching toward trains that would never reach them, toward roads that would be blocked before they arrived, toward a war they could no longer fight because a general on a muddy horse had given an order with no clause for mercy in the pursuit and every clause for mercy in the surrender. The Virginia Spring did not care about any of this. The dogwood bloomed along the roads Lee's men marched. The red clay dried and cracked in the April sun. The Appomattox River ran where it had always run, indifferent to the armies that had crossed it in both directions over 4 years of American catastrophe. On April 9th, in the late afternoon, when the papers had been signed and the terms accepted, Grant walked outside McLean's house and stood for a moment in the ordinary light of a Virginia spring afternoon. The war was over, or rather this part of it was over. The harder part, putting the country back together, deciding what it meant that 620,000 Americans had died, deciding what freedom actually meant for 4 million people just released from bondage. That part had not yet begun, and it would prove nearly as difficult and far less decisive than the war itself. But Grant did not know that yet. In the afternoon light, he knew only that a man he had been hunting for 7 days had met him in a farmhouse and asked for terms, and that he had offered terms that a man could accept without being destroyed by them. Not because he was weak, because he was strong enough to understand that ending a war is harder than fighting one, and that a peace built on humiliation is not peace at all, but only the next war waiting to happen. What Grant told his cavalry before the final hunt for Lee is remembered as strategy. Cut him off. Get ahead. Do not let him escape. Those words ended the war. But what Grant told his soldiers when Lee walked out of McLean's house, stop cheering, they are our countrymen now, That was the harder order, the one that required more discipline and more vision, the one that understood that the war's final purpose was not victory, but reunion, not the destruction of a people, but the restoration of a nation. Grant the general was brilliant. Grant the man, in that moment standing in the Virginia afternoon telling his soldiers to be quiet so a defeated enemy could keep his dignity, was something rarer. He was the right man in the right place, at the exact moment a country needed him most, doing the one thing no one had been able to do for 4 years. He was finishing it.